Again, thank you both for being here. We'll just introduce ourselves quickly. My name is Jordan Poos. I serve as the Director of Campus Ministry at Mount Marty College in Yankton, South Dakota. It's a Catholic Benedictine school. It was founded by the Benedictine Sisters of Sacred Heart Monastery here in Yankton. I serve also as an advisor for what we call the Green Lancers Club at the college. And so through that club, we had been planning on doing a Earth Week, being that Wednesday, April 22nd, marks the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So we were going to have a whole host of functions and activities, awareness campaigns, things like that going on our campus and around in the community. But in light of everything that has transpired on the planet, we weren't able to do that. And part of that Earth Week was going to be what we call the Adamah Symposium. So Adamah is a Hebrew word, means something like earth, and it comes from the Genesis account of creation. And so we've been hosting this symposium a couple times every year for the past year. This will be the third installment. This will be the first digital installment. And so as part of that, we had invited Dr. Dan Dileo and Laura Edwards to join us and talk about climate from both faith perspectives and also, what is the science, what's going on there, what's the actual data behind some of this stuff. So in light of that, I think that I will allow both Dan and Laura to introduce themselves. So again, whoever would like to go first on that, please go ahead.
Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today through this digital discussion, and I'm glad we could still have this discussion. And I am Laura Edwards. I'm the state climatologist for South Dakota, and I work for South Dakota State University Extension, based out of Aberdeen in the northeastern part of the state. I've been here as a state climatologist just over 3 years. And I've been in South Dakota since 2011. Previously, I worked at a regional climate center in Reno, Nevada, and also at a state climate office in Maryland when I was in graduate school. So I've been looking at trends and extremes since those days in graduate school, and really tied to the land here too in South Dakota, as we live on a farm here northeast of Aberdeen. So we live and experience the climate just as much as everybody else here in the region. And I'm happy to tie into some pieces of our personal lives too as we have this discussion, and I think that's an important piece of this as well. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here.
Terrific. My name is Dan Dileo. I'm the assistant professor and director of the Justice and Peace Studies program here at Creighton University here in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm a Catholic moral theologian, and I specialize in Catholic social teaching and climate change. And for the past decade, I've worked as a consultant with Catholic Climate Covenant, which is an organization based in Washington, D.C., of which the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is the founding member. So I did my dissertation on Laudato Si and have edited a book on the encyclical. I've got some journal articles and a special journal issue on the encyclical coming out soon. So I've been working on Catholic teaching and climate change for a while, and love talking about Laudato Si, so I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you as well. So I think just to start, Dan, if you could talk to us a little bit about Laudato Si, just kind of try to familiarize people with the document. If I'm correct, we're coming up on the 5th anniversary of the publication of the document. So if you could just give an overview of it a little bit, and maybe you could talk a little bit about, what Pope Francis is trying to share through that document.
Sure. And I want to take a few minutes and walk through some slides, because I think it's the most efficient way to do this. So I'm going to share my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. So I think in my experience, this is one of the most efficient ways to do this in terms of helping demonstrate how care for creation and attention to climate change are essential to the Catholic faith. That this isn't an optional or a secondary aspect, which is something that Pope Francis talks about in the encyclical. So to do that, I want to set up this schema and take just a couple minutes and walk through this, and hopefully that'll give us some context to have the conversation. So this is a schema that's been developed by two theologians, Ed Vasick and Jim Keenan. It has several different pieces, but I think is an effective way to tie together a lot of the dimensions of the Christian tradition. The first step in the schema begins with 1 John and the claim that God is love, talking about understanding God in the least inadequate way, is to begin to speak about God as love. The second aspect of the schema is the radical claim that God loves us personally and intimately. And in the Christian tradition, we speak about love in terms of willing and acting for the good of another. And so the claim here is that God loves us, wills and acts for our good, and invites us into a loving relationship. And the third step is that as free moral agents, we have the capacity to accept or reject that love. We have the ability to enter into friendship with God or not. And here we're talking about the Catholic definition of faith. Here from the Catechism, faith is defined as the adequate response to this invitation. And this is related to, but distinct from, additional concepts that people are familiar with in terms of spirituality and prayer. And I think we can speak about faith as beginning a relationship and beginning a spirituality understood as relationship. And within that relationship, prayer is the communication that happens. And so in this schema, we can see how some of these terms are potentially connected to each other. And presuming that we accept this invitation, the next step in this schema is conversion, and it comes from the insight and the reality that love always changes us. We're different because of authentic, loving relationships. Hopefully people have experienced that in their lives in human relationships, and as Ed Vasick says, it's even more true of our relationship with God. And he says here, union with God leads to union with God's loves, and so we will be inclined to love the neighbor whom God loves. And so as we enter more deeply into loving relationship with God, we're changed and transformed, and we begin to think and see and feel and hopefully act more in accord with God's love. And the fifth step in the schema is morality. And this is our response in the world through our actions and dispositions. So we respond in and through and with love. And we do so in all of the different relationships for which we are created. And here we're doing somewhat of a theological anthropology, talking about what it means to be human. And the Christian understanding is that we're made for relationship with God, with ourselves, with neighbor, and all of creation. And so in thinking about this schema, morality is how we begin to live out God's love in the world. And as Vasick and Keenan go on to say, this is helpful, but it doesn't provide us with specific direction. And so it provides a framework, but it ultimately leaves us with this question: how can and ought we who have been loved by God live? What does it mean concretely to respond to God's love in the world and in our different relationships? And here we can think about Catholic social teaching as a resource to begin answering this question. It doesn't give us automatic answers, but it's a resource to begin answering this question. Hopefully, as people are aware, Catholic social teaching is the long tradition going back essentially to 1891 of papal and episcopal documents, but it can be summed up in several different ways using themes and principles. What you see here is from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops identifying 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, the 7th of which is care for creation. And it's important to understand that we can look at each one of these principles, and I'll do that here in a second, but we can't lose the forest for the trees. And this is a bedrock insight to Laudato Si, as Francis says here in number 138. It cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. We have to appreciate how the different themes of Catholic social teaching are connected in ways that sometimes we don't always recognize. We'll talk about this in a second. But so Catholic social teaching is a resource to begin to try and figure out what it means and requires to live out God's love in the world. And so looking at the specific principle or theme of care for God's creation, this is nothing new for the Catholic tradition. So this is Pope John Paul II speaking in 1990, emphasizing that the ecological crisis is a moral issue. This is nothing new for the Catholic tradition. This did not begin with Francis in 2015 with Laudato Si. We can talk about ecology in terms of morality in several different ways. The first of which is that, as I say here, God whom we are called to love is present in all creation. In Ignatian language, we speak about finding God in all things. And so God whom we are called to love is present in all of God's creation. And so from that point, it's a moral dimension in terms of caring for creation. The second way to think about ecology in terms of morality is that creation has its own intrinsic dignity. If you remember the creation narratives in Genesis, God declares and identifies everything in creation as good at the end of each day before humans were created. And the connotation here is that creation has its own dignity and value irrespective of human utility. And so in terms of caring for God's creation, this makes it a moral issue for the Catholic tradition. And the third way in which we can think about it as moral is that ecological degradation harms our neighbor whom we are called to love. This gets back to the connections in terms of the themes of Catholic social teaching. And it comes from a recognition that as humans, we are creatures. As Francis says here in Laudato Si, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. And so inevitably what happens to quote unquote, the environment inevitably impacts human persons for better or for worse. And so in that way, we can think about care for creation as a moral issue. And we can also think about the specific themes of Catholic social teaching, commitments to life and dignity, how pollution and climate change make people sick, kill people. We can think about the option for the poor and vulnerable, how environmental degradation disproportionately harms the poor, who are often least responsible for causing these problems. And here we're using the virtue of prudence, which is classically defined by Aquinas as right reason applied to action. And so we're looking around and seeing what's happening in the world. We're engaging science and looking at it with the aid of faith. And so prudence is essential in terms of understanding creation as a moral issue. And so ultimately, in the Christian tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we're called, as we see here in Genesis 2:15, to cultivate and care for God's creation. And in the Catholic tradition, this happens in two ways, and they're always related and complementary. The U.S. bishops describe this as the 2 feet of love and action. The first is charitable works, and so we can think about this as local actions, addressing immediate needs and concerns in an ecological sense. For example, maybe turning off the lights, something like that. And that's all important, but in the Catholic tradition, charitable works always have to be complemented by social justice. And this is attention to systems and structures and policies that necessitate charitable works in the first place. And so social justice calls us to work for structural reform, for example, in public policy advocacy. And so these are the 2 ways that the church is called to live out God's love in the world. And so hopefully in light of all of this, this quote from Laudato Si hits home with people, where Francis says, living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or a secondary aspect of our Christian experience. And unfortunately, at least in my experience, care for creation is not understood as essential to the Catholic Christian tradition. And so hopefully this framework helps folks to recognize how this is essential and woven into the fabric of the fullness of faith in the Catholic Christian tradition. One other direction I'll take it before I stop, because I think this will hopefully tee it up for Laura, is to talk specifically about climate change in the Catholic tradition. And here again, we're not doing anything new. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis emphasizes climate change is a moral problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. He's building on the teachings of Benedict XVI and John Paul II, so again, he's not doing anything new. And we can think about it in terms of the themes of Catholic social teaching. So in terms of care for creation, science is telling us, for example, that 1/3 of all animal and plant species could be extinct by 2070 due to climate change. And so this implicates the Catholic commitment to care for God's creation. We can think about it in terms of human life and dignity. So the World Health Organization warns that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, diarrhea, malaria, and heat stress. And my colleague here at Creighton, Richard Miller, has cited Schellnhuber and Anderson, who warned that at 4 to 6 degrees of post-industrial warming, the carrying capacity of the planet could be reduced to between 500 million and 1 billion people. We currently have 7.7 billion people in the world, so a carrying capacity of less than 1 billion would stand to kill 87% of people in the world. So this is a preeminent life issue in many ways. And we can think about it in terms of the option for the poor and vulnerable. We know that it's the poor who are most impacted by environmental degradation. So what you see here is the world skewed according to those living on less than $1.25 a day. So the poorest places in the world are blown up and the wealthiest places in the world are contracted. And unfortunately, this is where climate change becomes an injustice, because it's the poorest places in the world who have contributed least to climate change historically. This map shows historic carbon pollution from 1850 to 2010. And so you can see it's the wealthiest places in the world who are most responsible for causing climate change. And so in terms of caring for the poor and vulnerable, a moral issue from the Catholic perspective. And so ultimately, in terms of responses in Laudato Si', Pope Francis emphasizes charitable works, so local things like avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water, etc. But even more so, he emphasizes social justice, how there's an urgent need to develop policies that in the next few years, the emission of carbon dioxide and other highly polluting gases can be drastically reduced, for example, substituting fossil fuels and developing sources of renewable energy. And in addition, he emphasizes ecological education. And here we can talk about different types of knowledge, both conceptual and evaluative. Conceptual being facts and figures and numbers, and evaluative being affective, experiential knowledge that we gain through contact with persons, communities, and creation. And along the lines of evaluative knowledge, Francis emphasizes that our goal is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. So he's emphasizing a robust ecological education. And ultimately, in terms of the Christian tradition, he's emphasizing the need for conversion. So at the end of the document, he says, so what we all need is an ecological conversion, whereby the effects of our encounter with Jesus Christ become evident in our relationship with the world around us. So a lot of material, a lot of conceptual, hopefully some evaluative knowledge, but hopefully some additional resources to help people think about how care for creation is essential to the Catholic Christian tradition.
Thank you. That, like you said, that was a crash course. So I think there'll be plenty to chew on from that. A few things popped into my head there, but before we start kind of bouncing questions back and forth, Laura, if you would be willing to kind of give us some of the, from the work that you do, some of the science, what you see happening in our region, some of the trends that you as a climatologist are watching. So if you could just kind of give us an overview of the things that you pay attention to and study.
Sure, yeah, happy to do that. I wanted to hit on a couple things that Dr. Dileo mentioned. First is the human life dignity aspect, and that faith communities are very unique in that they very strongly think about generations to come. And that's not true everywhere in every group. And that climate change is a long-term thing. You know, it's not just a step change that we just go up to suddenly or go down to, but that it happens over time, and what we're doing now, or what has happened decades ago, will continue to affect our climate and our environment decades to come, or centuries to come. The other part too is about poor and vulnerable communities. You don't have to look across the globe to find those. We have them right here in our backyard. A lot of our tribal communities are, among the poorest in our country here in what's otherwise a wealthy country, but we see that here locally, and I'll show a map of that as well. So I have some images to share. They're kind of less organized than what Dr. Dileo had, so if you bear with me as I kind of skip around a little bit with what I've got to share with you.
Great.
So looking at the temperature side of things first, this is from the National Climate Assessment. In 2017, there was a climate science special report that basically laid down the climate science basics of what we know across the United States, and that led into the National Climate Assessment, which talked more about the impacts of climate change that we're seeing across the nation. So here you can see the annual temperature trends. This is comparing roughly the early 1900s to the period around 2000. So looking at the some decades around early 1900s to the decades around 2000. And you can see the trends are warming everywhere across our region anyway, in South Dakota and Nebraska. Less so in the southeastern part of the state, and that's been pretty consistent that they've actually been slightly cooling on an annual basis. But what's interesting too is that we see not equal warming in all the seasons. And so two samples of that are down low there, where you see actually wintertime is warming faster than summertime. And there are, different reasons and different hypotheses on why that is. But just to know that we're not seeing the same impacts across the different seasons as far as the rise in temperature in our region. See, one of the ways that we do see this that might people be aware of are plant hardiness zones. These are the things that you see on the back of your seed packets if you're planting a garden or plants for your yard. And these were the older version of that in 1990. We're seeing much warmer winters now, and that they updated these in 2012. And a lot of those zones are moving northward as a lot of the country here is warming. A lot of our region, at least, is warming. And so that allows us to plant different shrubs and trees in our yard, but also allows overwintering of different diseases, different insects, and other pests. So there's kind of opportunities and challenges, I'd say both, with the warming temperatures that we see in our region. I will skip ahead a little bit here to look at precipitation. So here, this is, I think, one of the really high impact pieces of where we're seeing a changing climate in our region and in South Dakota in particular. Looking at the top map there, that's our trend in precipitation. Again, comparing early 1900s to around 2000. South Dakota is getting wetter faster than almost anywhere else in the country in that darkest green color. That's about 15% or more, 20% in some areas over that time. And so anyone who's lived here recently in the last few decades has probably seen and just become aware of how much wetter it's been, how much more flooding we've had. Just in 2019, last year, 2011 was another big year. And similar to temperature, we don't see the changes in precipitation evenly spread throughout the year. We're seeing more of that increase in precipitation coming in the spring and the fall seasons. So for agriculture, for example, that's a huge challenge because that's coming when they want to get out in the field to plant in the spring and when they want to harvest in the fall. And then we've seen that several recent years, actually. And so being able to manage this, what people might call excess of precipitation, but again, it can be a benefit if we have longer, warmer growing seasons and more precipitation, since we don't have a lot of irrigation, at least in South Dakota. This can provide an opportunity to increase our agricultural yields. But again, there's a downside of, well, you have to manage all the other challenges that come with it, like changes in pests, plant disease, and those kinds of things. On the community side, you know, in urban environments, there are different impacts, such as maybe health issues related to more water or mold, maybe more flooding in urban environments, and those kinds of things. And we can talk about those later if you want to. I'm going to skip out here. One thing that that we use to explain or use to describe what's the difference between natural climate changes and the effect of humans or the anthropogenic influence on climate. And this is looking at climate models and looking at observations over the last 130 years or so. And the black line is the observations in temperature, or say the global change in temperature. If we look at only natural factors, you look at that green shading, and as you get closer in the last few decades, since about the 70s, around 1980, you start to see the split between the green, the natural factors, and the black line, the observations. So now we cannot recreate, basically, we cannot have our current climate without including human factors around the globe. So this is telling us that, yes, there is a human influence in our global temperature, at least, and that's closely tied to precipitation as well. So again, just emphasizing that we have to have both of those pieces to create the climate that we're in now. And looking back here at looking at poor and vulnerable populations, here's a map of all of the tribal lands in the Northern Plains. And there are a lot of them up here. And so again, we don't have to look far to reach out to those who are have less capacity, I'd say, to adapt or mitigate or take action when they have, some of them, some very strong social concerns before they can address the environmental concerns in their areas. One last thing I'd just like to share is, you know, looking at families, and our kids are really excited to make changes, and thinking of Earth Day this week as well. And this was actually from a couple of years ago. One of our kids made this picture about changing the world and a switch. And I think that's a pretty cool picture to say that they are thinking of what we can do now to affect our environment and our climate in a better way in the future. And a lot of young people are thinking about this, and I think it's a great opportunity and a great connection to tie into. So I'll leave it at that for now. Okay.
Thank you so much. I love that piece of art. I feel like you could put that on a t-shirt. Just some questions come to my mind from what both of you have said. And you both also, I feel like you could chime in and ask each other questions too. So please be invited to do that. But Dr. Dileo, just something that off the top of my head that I've been thinking about quite a bit is, you know, you mentioned that there's like this inherent dignity to creation, that the dignity of creation is not predicated on its utility to humans. And I think this kind of connects to this thing I've been thinking about, how, you know, how we become more aware of how we are members of creation, I think is the word that would come to me, members of creation. That, you know, theologically, I don't know how this fits in, or even, you know, historically, how some of this has developed in, you know, theological thinking. But, I think there can almost be this idea that like the earth is just kind of a train taking me to my next stop, which might be, the afterlife or the eternal. And I've wondered how that might impact what kind of responsibility we feel that we have to be stewards or to live well with creation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts along that thinking.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic question or point to raise. In many ways, it has to do. I mean, it has to do with fundamental beliefs about the Christian life and what it entails and requires. And I start off a lot of my classes talking with my students about the Our Father and the notion of on earth as it is in heaven. And because I think that gives a segue into at least beginning to think about how we're called to understand our time now. And this is what the Second Vatican Council described as the role of the church, is vocation of the church and all Christians is to advance God's kingdom. This is Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council, that we are called, and that's why I start off with this schema, because we are called as Christians to enter into loving relationship with God that ultimately transforms us and impacts how we live in the world, to the point that we are co-collaborators with God in advancing God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And so I think when we begin to think about the Christian life that way, it makes the moral life essential. It makes morality the essential response to spirituality understood as relationship with God. So it challenges the notion that we can somehow separate spirituality and prayer from morality, and vice versa. So this whole process makes morality spiritual at its source, and it makes spirituality manifest in morality. And so the fullness of faith requires that we integrate, or we recover a more integrated understanding of spirituality and morality, and then we understand care for creation as one aspect of morality in the Christian tradition. So it kind of pushes back against a sort of escapism that this is basically just kind of a transient space that doesn't really require much of us aside from personal piety.
I think, again, from like a Christian perspective, something that's helped me a little bit is just thinking about, like the incarnation, that, if God were to take on flesh, this is good stuff, this earth, this creation, this is good stuff. So I don't know how you feel that incarnational view, how that might help us, if you have any thoughts.
Sure, I mean, it's sanctified. I mean, the incarnation underscores the sanctification of all creation, that everything is sacred, or as Gerard Manley Hopkins, the Jesuit poet, would describe, is charged with the grandeur of God. All of creation is sacred, as evidenced foremost by the incarnation, that God became human, that God that God took on creation and affirmed the inherent dignity and goodness of all creation. So, in that way, it's we're on sacred ground when we're starting to think about ecology generally, especially in light of the incarnation.
A couple of thoughts that come to mind here with the Genesis story too. Looking in the Bible that I grew up with in the Catholic Church, the one my grandma gave me, right in the Genesis story, it has that diagram of the earth and the different layers, and it has the sea and the ocean way above us, and that's not the way it is now. We know that's not how the earth works, that there's ocean down here, but it's not like a literal ocean above us. And so that science and faith don't have to be mutually exclusive, that both are kind of adaptive. as we learn more about science and how the world works, that our faith adapts to that in some way, if that's a good way of saying that in a layperson's view, and can take on different interpretation. And also too, about the morality part of it, perhaps, thinking of climate that affects everybody. It doesn't affect just specific people here or there, or specific populations for this reason or another, that it's kind of equal opportunity for everybody, and that we're all affected by it in some way, I'd say.
Yeah.
You know, our current situation with, a global pandemic, I think, as terrible as this is, it's such a vivid demonstration for us, I think, of how, what happens, all the way on the other side of the planet can affect me in a very intimate way. And, how can we extend that analogy to the climate, that reality to the climate? Just as you're saying, it's a common good, really, it's a common good.
Well, and I think it underscores, what we're saying right now underscores our creatureliness. We are creatures that are part of the biological, non-human natural world. And whatever happens, physiologically, inevitably, in one way or another, impacts human persons and communities. And I think it's also illustrating the interconnectedness of social and economic and political realities that, all of this has had butterfly effects in every area of our lives. And so I think it is an unfortunate illustration of Pope Francis's emphasis in Laudato Si that everything is interconnected. The term he gives that is integral ecology, that everything is interconnected. So I think in that way, we're also seeing inequalities in terms of how the virus, but also the responses are disproportionately impacting marginalized communities. So I think it's providing an illustration of how inequality works in society. But I think in my mind, there's also an optimistic side in terms of social justice, because the scale and scope of climate change is going to require macro level solutions. And those are, in a sense, overwhelming. But I think what we're seeing with the pandemic is that when we decide as communities and societies to make decisions, we can make pretty significant decisions pretty quickly. So I guess to me, there's a hopefulness that we can learn from the experience of our response to the virus and translate that into systemic macro level action in response to climate change, which similarly to the virus engages science, the virtue of prudence, the right reason to action. So I think there's a lot of connections to be made. My hope is that we learn from it in time to mitigate the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think you're right on there. I had another question, Dr. Dileo, just to unpack that a little bit, to this idea of like this interconnectedness. I just got a mailer today from the Berry Center, which connected with Wendell Berry, the author, and his family. And so I'm a big Wendell Berry reader. And so on this mailer, there was an excerpt from a talk that he gave on the first Earth Day in 1970, and expressing this very idea of, when we understand that a lot of these things are connected, how the violence that we perpetrate against the earth is a mirror of the violence that we perpetrate against each other, and trying to connect those things. One thing, just kind of thinking from the academic world, I think there's benefit in specialization and being able to hone in on a particular area of study, and I think we've seen a lot of benefit from that as a people. But what kind of challenge does that pose for trying to create these integrated worldviews that can help us see that these things are interconnected. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is part of what Francis talks about in Laudato Si when he talks about the technocratic paradigm. And it's interesting in number 110, if folks are familiar with the document, he speaks to exactly what you're saying. He says, the specialization which belongs to technology makes it difficult to see the larger picture. The fragmentation of knowledge proves helpful for concrete applications, yet it often leads to a loss of appreciation for the whole, for the relationship between things, and for the broader horizon, which then becomes irrelevant. And so I think you're, in terms of academia, and Laura, I'm sure you've seen this in your work as well, is that there's, as Jordan said, benefits to specialization and digging into the particularities of one area or topic or field, but kind of like with Catholic social teaching and the themes of the tradition, there's a tremendous danger that we lose the forest for the trees. And when that happens, like Francis says, fragmentation of knowledge becomes a detriment. And Laura, like I said, I'm sure you've seen that in your work working in science and then trying to translate that into other disciplines or work with folks outside of your field.
Yeah, we do see that a lot. And, one thing we're looking at climate projections and what do we expect to see going forward. We continue to see, consistent models projecting warmer temperatures and projecting, at least the same amount of precipitation, if not more. And, but people want to know what's happening in their backyard, what's happening on my farm, my garden, my city. And yes, that's important. But when they're trying to think of what can they do, that gets to an action thing. What can they do at their local level? But also too, thinking of the virus and that impact, we've seen a lot of actions of people branching out and reaching out to communities and individuals and groups that haven't before, still making new connections. And, just getting down to deeming who's essential and who's not, looking at agriculture communities, who's essential, looking at what's going on right now at the Smithfield processing plant, Sioux Falls. How much pork is that going to stop from getting to market and affecting the food supply? So we see a lot of that local and, global, but probably global, at least larger regional impacts and connections, I think, changing, and people are really taking a different view, I'd say, at a lot of different things, not just the climate and the environment.
Laura, if I could ask, I'm curious, in terms of your experience trying to communicate the science to folks, is it, in broad terms, something that folks have been receptive to? Is it something that people have kind of been ambivalent about, or that they've outright challenged, kind of in terms of the work that you do trying to share the science with people? Kind of what's been your experience working in the state?
Yeah, it's kind of been a mix. I'd say, 8-9 years ago when I first came here, there was a little more skepticism than there is now. Mm-hmm. I'd say, I work a lot with farmers, and we did a survey in 2012 all across the Corn Belt region. And at that time, about 2/3 of farmers would agree that the climate is changing due to either human, natural, or both kind of causes. We haven't done a new survey of that, but I would say that it's increased now, and that a lot of people are really now experiencing the extremes and experiencing the impacts. With both drought and flood, we've seen many wide extremes here in the last 5-6 years that I think people are really witnessing it now, and so they're a little more accepting of it on an individual level, at least.
Laura, that kind of prompts a question for me too, just in terms of, either in the science community that you communicate with, or even solutions that you hear from people. like what in your view will help us to try to mitigate some of these things or become more resilient? You know, sustainability is the word right now. You know, is it things with the energy sector? You know, what kind of things could be done with agriculture? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different angles and different perspectives, which means there's a lot of different solutions too. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all problem, but you know, energy use has been one of the biggest things. You know, we're talking about greenhouse gases being one of the primary drivers, the primary driver of changing our global temperature and precipitation patterns. And, you know, that leads to fuel use, fuel economy in vehicles and transportation. But also to being conscientious of how we use our resources. You know, we're here right locally, we're fortunate in that we have plentiful water for the most part. But there are parts of even our country that's not true. We have pretty good access to food and affordable food, but that's not true everywhere. So maybe, you know, backyard gardens, local vendors, you know, looking at farmers markets, you know, we're able to grow a lot of food here locally without having to transport it very far. And so, you know, there's a lot of things people can do there. I'd say, again, just fuel use, water use, and how we get food are probably the top three that people consider and think about, and that I think about.
Great. Do either of you have any questions of each other? Anything that comes to your mind?
That was
I
my
would
biggest
say,
question. Go ahead.
I have a question for Dr. Dileo, I guess. You know, I kind of touched on the science and faith topic a little bit. I guess what's kind of the thinking now in the Catholic Church, would you say, on accepting science and faith?
Sure. So I think in general, it's in Fides et Ratio, which was John Paul II's encyclical in 1998. He talked about how faith and reason are like the two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Just kind of a poetic mouthful to say that they are not opposed. In his address to an earlier address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he quoted Leo XIII that truth can't deny truth, meaning what we know to be true about the physical world can't be challenged, and what we know about truth in terms of you know, revelation and in the world of faith is also true. So that way they're innately and inherently complementary because they are seeking the same thing, namely truth, the source of which is ultimately God. So I think that's the Catholic position and has been for at least authentically for a long time. And I think that's where the virtue of prudence comes in, because again, as you know, Aquinas defined it, right reason applied to action. We have to act in light of what we know, and we know what science tells us, and we know what other disciplines tell us. And so I think that's where I think it's important. What's interesting to me, and I say this as a moral theologian, I think that's also a place where the Catholic tradition and religious traditions more broadly can be kind of a value add to the conversation, because science and economics, for that matter, speak in more objective, calculated terms, and faith is able to bring values into the conversation in a way that might inspire and animate people aren't moved immediately by numbers and data and things like that. And so I think in terms of the role of the church in the public square and talking about climate change, I really do think that's one of the the value adds that the faith community can bring is being able to talk about human life and dignity and the option for the poor and vulnerable and things like that. So, but again, we do that in light of what we know, prudentially engaging what the science is telling us. So, so I think, as John Paul said, they're complementary, faith and reason. And I guess
that's been my experience too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up question, because that was kind of my most pressing question in terms of your reception, or the reception of folks to your work and the science. When you've worked especially with faith communities, do you have a sense that there is an approach to ecology broadly and climate change specifically that is essentially connected to their faith, or do you see people kind of separating them, that what they do in terms of farming or business or whatever is kind of over here, and their work or their understanding of faith is kind of separate from that in terms of ecology? Or do you see an integration of the work that you do when you speak with persons in communities of faith?
I think I've kind of seen both. One is the science and faith perspectives that we just talked about a little bit, keeping those separate. A lot of people like to keep them separate, but really, I don't feel you have to choose one or the other. You can have both. And the other, about tying to ecology, I think more and more faith communities are talking about that. I think historically it's kind of been, untouchable topic, but I think now as communities are seeing more real impacts locally, I think it really has to happen locally sometimes for them to start those conversations. But I think they are talking about that more and being stewards of the resources we have, natural resources, being stewards of the environment, and again, that morality part of looking out for others. I think all of that is starting to tie together more recently. Yeah.
And that's why, Jordan, I'm so glad that in your role, you're working campus ministry, but you're also in mission, because I think grounding all of this in mission is the key in terms of fidelity to our own mission, making sure that we're living the fullness of faith. But I also think it's effective in terms of once all of this is understood as essential to mission, it's not an optional choice or consideration or discussion. This is something that as communities and institutions rooted in Catholic mission, we have an obligation to consider in fidelity to that mission. So, so Jordan, I'm so grateful for the work that you do and the place that you're in at Mount Marty.
Yeah, thank you. My experience of the Benedictine charism is that, Benedictines are very much caretakers. I think that's part of, just kind of part of the tradition. They're stewards. Benedict says in the rule that we are to treat all things as vessels of the altar. And Benedictines are very great caretakers, and maybe to a fault. Nothing ever gets thrown away, and the furniture, you go into a monastery, it's going to be from all kinds of different decades and eras, but you're in a Benedictine place. You just feel it. And historically, I think Benedictines have had a pretty close relationship with the land in decades past. I'm not sure how long ago that this changed, but there was a working farm right here, connected with our monastery,
really,
which is right near our campus. And so our sisters definitely have a deep connection with the earth. And so I think it connects with our Benedictine tradition very well. And I don't know if I had said this maybe when we had talked earlier, but one of the 10 hallmarks of Benedictine education that have been developed by the Benedictine colleges and universities in the United States is stewardship. So we're trying to explore that a little bit more and to deepen our commitment to that, I think, as an institution. I think we're getting close to an hour here, so I just kind of want to have some ending questions for both of you. and they're kind of double questions, but you both can take them. So I think, Dr. Dileo, we'll start with you. If people want to learn more about the church's understanding of relationship to the earth, where would be a good place for them to go? And then kind of to tag on to that question, what is something that you would want to say to young people, maybe college-aged people, about how, they might explore how their faith can connect to the relationship with the earth?
Sure. So I'll share my screen again, because this is the website for Catholic Climate Covenant. So as I said, this is the organization I've consulted with for the last 10 years, based in Washington, D.C. And it's an organization founded in 2006 with support of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so it's an organization that tries to coordinate all of the work on climate change in the U.S. Catholic Church, working with all of these different partners, so Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities USA. So if folks are interested, I think this would be an especially helpful place to start. We've got teachings in terms of popes and bishops from around the world. So I think this is, at least in my experience, a helpful place for people to at least start to engage this a little bit more. In terms of what I would say to folks, especially to young people, I think what I emphasize with my students more than anything else is that in terms of climate change, this is a macro level issue that requires the church's commitment to social justice. Charitable works are important. They help cultivate virtue. They express values. They help educate other people. The scale and scope and urgency of the climate crisis is not something that we will individually bike our way out of. This will require public policies at the state, federal, international level. Those are things that the Church, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Vatican has for decades affirmed and advocated for. So in terms of what people can do, I think the single biggest recommendation that I give to people is to get politically active on this issue. And on the Covenant website, there are the advocacy items that we work on in collaboration with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So I think more than anything, to engage in the social justice dimension of addressing climate crisis.
If I could ask you as well, that you mentioned the Covenant, could you talk about Catholic Energies just a little bit?
Sure. Excuse me. So Catholic Energies is the project of the Covenant that was developed essentially to provide what kind of call a one-stop shop for Catholic organizations that are seeking to either do renewable energy projects or energy conservation projects. So you've got the website here, catholicenergies.org. But essentially, we provide the wraparound support in terms of project design, implementation, but also financing. So a lot of the barriers to Catholic institutions being able to do some of these projects is both expertise, people just don't quite know where to start, but then also the funding. And so this is something where through the Catholic Energies program, we're able to provide upfront financing that enable Catholic communities to pursue these projects without the financial barriers. And so this is something that provides support in those areas, but also connects it explicitly to the Catholic tradition. So this isn't kind of a secular organization. This is something that by definition is framing all this in terms of fidelity, fidelity to the Catholic tradition. So we help, we help provide the educational resources to help people make those connections as they're actually doing these projects. So that's a resource that is also available for folks if they're interested.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like that's a kind of an exciting development, and there's been some exciting projects going on with that. So, Laura, my questions are similar. If people want to learn more about maybe the work that you do, or even more climate science, what would be some good resources for them? And then also, what is something that you would like to express to young people in this regard?
Okay. Yeah, first of all, for what we know about climate science, I think the first stop great resource is the National Climate Assessment, and I'll pull up that website here in a minute, where that is updated every few years, and already they are preparing for the next release of that. Excuse me, just this last release was in late of 2018. So let me share my screen here. And so here it is, the fourth National Climate Assessment. You can look at some of their summary findings, look at different chapters, where actually they split it up into different systems like ecosystems, coastal, oceans, agriculture, and so on. And then they kind of have some cross-cutting areas like human health, which might be important to this group, tribes and indigenous peoples. And then they sort it out by regions, in which here we're in the Northern Great Plains. And this is another cross-cutting chapter where it touches what are the key messages for our part of the country specifically. So they start with water and go down through some details specifically to our region. So I'd say this is the first great stop for a non-specialist. If you want to dig deeper into the data that's behind this, that's the Climate Science Special Report from 2017. And see here, I don't have it bookmarked here. Yep. And it looks very similar, a website like this that also sorts into chapters where you can just look at temperature, precipitation, droughts, floods, wildfire, that kind of thing as well. Specifically in Nebraska, I know the State Climate Office and Nebraska Extension have a couple publications out there. We are still working on some of those here specifically for South Dakota, so we don't have so much of that right now. But that's a big resource. As far as what to tell students and those who might be listening, I think, again, when I think back to when I was growing up as a Catholic girl at a Catholic school, and my parents really encouraged exploration in science. That's what I was already geared towards. I knew, or I thought I knew when I was in 4th grade, I wanted to be a meteorologist. So they let me pursue that. And I think keep asking questions. Again, we said earlier, you don't have to choose between science and faith. And this time at home, maybe when you're with your loved ones, whether it be your friends, family, whoever that might be, it's a great time to tie in the multi-generations too, and start thinking about that, what you might do, how you might change, if at all, if what you're doing is what you want to be doing in consideration of our changing climate. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Just to kind of comment on that too, I have my undergrad in biology. So I would often be sitting in a science course, an ecology class or something, and you'd learn something. And I was brought to what I would call kind of a sense of awe, or, it was almost a contemplative moment for me. And so, tensions between science and religion I've never understood that myself, just from some of these experiences. So I'm glad to see there's a movement and there's a desire to try to integrate these different areas of knowledge. So I think that will pretty much sum up our time. This has been awesome. I feel like we could do this every week and pick a different topic. And I guess, if our current situation lasts, for a long time, maybe we'll have to do that, and we'll create a series out of it or something. But this has been awesome. I'm excited to share this with everybody. So I appreciate both of you taking some time to chat here, and appreciate the work that you're doing, and hope that we can all stay connected, and we can all be a benefit to each other. So
this has been a pleasure.
Yes, we'll be in touch, I'm sure. So
look forward to it.
Yes, peace with everything that you have going on, and might we all stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Great,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Laura.
Yes.
Thank you.